Hey folks, Gwe. I want to talk a little bit about Senator Chuck Grassley today. Chuck is a U.S. Senator from Iowa who this past weekend has accepted the endorsement of former President Donald Trump. Now, in and of itself, that's not what we're going to talk about. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people out there talking about it, so if you'd like to talk about it, there's places to do that. But it was what Chuck said about why he accepted the endorsement. What was the motivating factor behind him accepting the endorsement of former President Donald Trump? You see, Chuck wasn't always on board with what the former president said, did, or wanted. There were lots of times where he came out as a critic, and he came out as someone who was denouncing what the former president was doing while he was in office before losing the election. And so it's kind of surprising that Senator Grassley accepted the endorsement until you read why. See, what he says his reason is something along the lines of, I was born at night, but not last night. I know that he is more popular with Iowa voters than I am. And it wouldn't be smart to reject his endorsement. Now, if you open that up, what he's saying between the lines, those words that, aren't spoken, I'm afraid that if I don't accept Donald Trump's endorsement, he could hurt my chances for re-election. Now, Chuck Grassley's been elected, I want to say, since 1959, he has been continuously re-elected into the U.S. Senate. I think this is his 8th or 9th re-election bid. And he's afraid that Donald Trump, the former president, Donald Trump, could hurt his chances at re-election if he did not accept the endorsement. When we accept an endorsement, it's not just as simple as saying, oh, you like me, thanks, yeah, I appreciate that. I accept the fact that you like me. No. We know that the former president's, any person of power really, isn't going to do something like this for free, that there was some cost for Chuck Grassley in this. There was some quid pro quo. And Chuck was willing to pay that because he was afraid that if he did not accept the endorsement of the former president would make his life, his re-election bid, much harder. In the Bible, there's that, Sunday school famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. And in the book of Daniel, in that book of story and prophecy, we also hear the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these four people, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all sort of go through the same trial. Because they're Jewish kids, right? They're good Jewish kids who were taken from their homeland, and they were taken from their families during the exile when the Babylonians attacked and defeated what we know to be the nation of Israel, Judah and Israel. They were taken back to Babylon, and they were taught the Babylonian ways. They were taught things like mathematics, and they were taught things like law, and they were taught things like writing and the alphabet, and they were taught Babylonian customs and Babylonian cultures, and they were expected to become a part of Babylonian society, and Babylonian society was expected, and culture was expected to become a part of them. This was how the Babylonians did their thing. They would always, from conquered nations, they would bring people back. They would take what they loved about these countries that they had just captured and make it a part of themselves. And they would force a part of themselves, a part of their culture, a part of their society upon those other countries. And that's how they maintained their empire. It was one of the ways they maintained their empire. So Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were excelling. They were doing really, really well. The king was really happy with their work. They were gaining trust, they were gaining power, they were gaining knowledge, they were doing good work for the empire. Until some of the king's advisors came along, jealous about what they were seeing Daniel and the boys get for their efforts. And they said, "King, everybody should bow down to you. We should write a law where everybody is required to bow down and pray to you every day." And the king says, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I'm pretty awesome. I would like it if everybody bowed down to me once a day." But the Jewish people, they weren't going to do that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, they were not going to bow down. There is one God and the Lord is his name. They were not going to bow down to the king. They were not going to pray to the king. They were not going to worship the king. They were only ever going to worship one God, and that was it. And when the king heard this, the king went into hysterics. And the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown into a furnace. Daniel later on was thrown into the lion's den. And we know that when those three guys were thrown into the furnace, that as the furnace heated up, an angel of the Lord came and saved them. And they walked out of the furnace. Even their clothes weren't singed. And Daniel, when he was thrown into the lion's den, the king went back the next morning. And the king loved Daniel. When he went back the next morning and he saw Daniel laying among the lions. Their mouths had been closed by the Lord. He praised God. He was so thankful that Daniel was alive. And then he threw those assistants of his, those advisors of his, he threw them into the lion's den because they pitted him against God. They gave him bad advice. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't have to go through these trials. They chose to go through these trials. These trials were the consequence for their refusal to worship the king. All they had to do was worship the king. They didn't have to mean it, right? They could have faked it. But no, that wasn't them. They weren't going to bow down to the king. They weren't going to worship the king, and they knew what the consequences of their actions was going to be. They knew that their lives were going to become immensely more difficult because they refused this law, because they refused to listen to this ruler, this person of power, this person of authority. They refused to listen to this person who could guarantee their safety and their prosperity. Jesus, in the same way, refused to listen to the devil when the devil promised him sustenance, prosperity, and power, and safety, and authority. Chuck failed this test. And you and I, we will, in our communities, big and small, we will find ourselves being asked this same question. We will face this same challenge to some extent. To one extent or another, somebody will come along who promises us the world if we just give ourselves to them. They will promise to keep us safe if we just give ourselves to them. They will promise to make us prosperous, to make us abundant. They promise to give us control and authority if we just give ourselves to them, if we choose to follow them in this world. That is the test. That's the test of Daniel. Chuck Grassley has an 81% approval rating among Iowa Republican voters. Donald Trump, the former president Donald Trump, has a 91% approval rating. Chuck was in no danger of losing in the primary. Not at 81% approval. He's in no danger of losing in the primary. And yet he was afraid of that little extra that the former president held. So afraid of it. So afraid that the president would harm him politically, that he gave himself to him. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord's face be made to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord's countenance be lifted up to you. May you always know the peace of being in the Lord's presence. I pray that when we are faced by this question, by this test, when we are faced with this challenge, that recognizing the consequences for saying no to people of power, to people of authority, to kingmakers, we will still side with the righteous. We will still side with our conscience. We will still side with our personal integrity. Because we can't be people of Christ unless we do. Amen. Nemultus.